Dear friends, dear colleagues, dear art lovers, before starting, just a personal note. I would like to dedicate this lecture to somebody who has been supporting me for 40 years, who followed all the things I did, who would have loved to have been here, but unfortunately died early this morning. May this lecture be a symbol of gratitude for not being there. Ladies and gentlemen, if you hope to have a lecture on the life and work of Bruegel, neatly in chronological order, surveying all his works, I have to disappoint you. I will not be giving such a lecture. I will be taking the point of departure of our exhibition, which is the creative process, as the starting point. I would like to take you on an adventure, a journey, on the pictorial strategy, and as Stefan in his all too kind introduction said, his visual rhetorics. Setting the scene, leading the eye, leading our eye, showing you, I hope, his visual intelligence, his grasp of visual psychology, of course not being aware of the term which Freud would coin in this city so much later. I would like to emphasize, and I want to show you, that Bruegel works like the best film directors. Oh no, we should put it the other way around. The best film directors work like Bruegel did 450 years ago. I'm not making, or fully making, an analysis of my own. I'm going back to the theory and practice of rhetorics. Not only the rhetorics of art, but rhetorics on art in general. I will be referring to terms and the way art theory was phrased in the 16th and early 17th century. And I will base my observations on the comments which were made on Bruegel, the artist, the man, and his work in the 16th century. So the underlying questions of my preoccupation with Bruegel, with our preoccupation, because it's teamwork, and I would here like to thank Elke and Sabine and Alice and Ron for going on this adventure together, is why is he one of the greatest artists alive? Why are we taking the trouble for the first time ever, and probably for the last time in 50 years, to have this suicidal undertaking? Why does Bruegel suck you into an image? Why, if you look in the galleries, this happens. Why do people look at works by Bruegel so long and intense? Something which they did in the 16th century as well. Why does the appreciation of Bruegel transcend cultures and backgrounds, not only in knowledge of art, but Bruegel is one of the most favorite artists in Japan and in Korea, completely different cultural backgrounds. And I would like to end why, and then we come to something which is also very personal. Why is Bruegel relevant today? I will not have answers. I will have some suggestions. And if you, after this lecture, and after reading the catalogue, look at Bruegel with different eyes, I will be a happy man. Very, very briefly, the life of the man you see behind us. This is the only image which we have of Bruegel, which is more or less contemporary. Was published in 1571, 2 years after his death, but probably based on a portrait made during his lifetime. Very plain, go through his life really in 5 minutes. Born somewhere, we don't know for sure, between 1525 and 1530, probably in Brabant. This is the area north of Antwerp. And we hope at the conference to have some more clues and some more information in a lecture by one of our guests. He was certainly trained in Antwerp. He was trained in the workshop of Pieter Bruegel van Aalst, an artist not known very well today, although he had a large retrospective in the Metropolitan a few years ago. And there he was trained in the art of painting, in the art of drawing, in the art of miniature. His mother-in-law was Maiken Verhulst. Contemporaries wrote of Maiken Verhulst, who was the wife of Pieter Bruegel, as the best miniature painter of her times. Alas, we have no works by Maiken. And this is new as a hypothesis, which we phrased in our catalogue. We think he was also trained in the art of painting and making cartoons. Just up here, the fabulous cartoon by Jan Vermeijen. They were made in the workshop by Pieter Bruegel van Aalst at the very moment Bruegel was there. He had learned all techniques. He had learned to paint in a minute way. He had learned to paint in a loose way. He had learned to paint small objects, and he had learned how to paint large works. The context is very important when we go on our stroll through his rhetorics. Is the city of Antwerp. A booming city. A city booming like cities are now in China, some places in Africa and Southern America. A city that grew from 1510 to 1580 from 10,000 inhabitants to 80,000 inhabitants, which was the most dynamic, innovative city in the north of Europe. Much more important than Paris, much more important than London. Forget about the peasant Bruegel. He's firmly embedded in the city. In the development of those booming cities, it was the richest part, together with the north of Italy, it's the richest part of Europe, the most innovative part, was booming, and he there lived in the cities, and he was connected to what we call the new rich, a venture capitalist like Jacques Jongeling, who was one of his prime most important patrons, like Noiret, who was the governor of the central bank, Granvelle, Cardinal Granvelle, the most powerful religious person, and then you're also politically important in the 16th century in the southern Netherlands. He was a friend of the geographer and humanist Ortelius and of the playwright, artist, moralist Cornhert. That's his world. Leaning against the humanist, leaning probably part of the higher part of society. My guess now is that he probably didn't even have to work to make a living. That's why he could afford, and that's also important, because one of the main questions was, when we started, people asked us, are the paintings by Bruegel made by himself? Because the common practice in the 16th and 17th century were large workshops, the Bosch workshop, the Frans Floris workshop, the Rubens, Rembrandt. No, we are quite sure, after all these years of research, the works which we have by Bruegel are all single-handed. A small production. We now have, in my catalogue, 43 paintings. We have added one, the view of the Bay of Naples, which you will find opposite the two towers of Babel. And we also think that the Tuchlein in Brussels, the Adoration of the Shepherds, is also by Bruegel. So 45 paintings, 65 drawings, a small corpus made between 1552 and 1568. Raised in Antwerp, went to Italy, Rome, but even south as Messina, Palermo, 1552-54, and came back to work for Hieronymus Koch. Not a name now known, but the most important engraver and print publisher in entire Europe in the third quarter of the 16th century. Antwerp was the center of book production, Christophe Plantin, and of print production. Books and prints from Antwerp were all over Europe. They were advertised in the Frankfurter Buchmesse. Yes, the Frankfurter Buchmesses existed. Yes, there were catalogs, so we know what was available. And he started, and we will see this, as a landscape artist. Very important, but we'll emphasize this later. slowly returned to painting. So he was a draftsman, designing prints, and slowly returned to painting from 1557, 58, concentrating more on painting, and then from 1561 onwards, it's his career as a painter which is the most important. 1563, he leaves Antwerp and goes to Brussels, possibly to be closer to the court, possibly because he was interested in the tapestry weaving industry. And then we have the last dated works from 1568, and we know he's buried in the church, the Kapellenkerk in Brussels in 1569, so we presume he was too ill to work in the year 1569. So there he is, an artist with a very small corpus, very famous in his own time. He was seen as the most important painter after Bosch, and Bosch was the most famous painter in the first quarter of the 16th century, and the people said this is the new Jeroen Bosch, even surpassing the master. So here we have him. So now I start with a survey of his pictorial strategy, and I said, he's a landscape painter. He was defined by his contemporaries as the most innovative landscape painter. Landscape painting, ladies and gentlemen, as a separate genre, started in the early 16th century in Antwerp. Very telling is when Albrecht Dürer, at that point the most famous artist alive in Europe, making a triumphal journey through the Netherlands. He was 10 months, he was in Antwerp. Why? Because this was this booming city and he hoped to have commissions. And there he writes in his diary that he met Meister Joachim, der Gut Landschaftsmaler, the very first time in history that we know the word Landschaftsmaler. So it's Pateneer, Joachim Pateneer, who defines the landscape, and it is Bruegel who redefines it and sets the landscape as it will develop until about 1620, 1630. And then, yes, Stefan already said, I will start with a drawing. And it's a drawing which you will see return, because in this small object, and this is one of the drawings which I was able to rediscover, which was not known at all, was bought in the 90s by a collector as something in the circle of Jan Bruegel the Elder. The collector came to me and said, it cannot not be slightly elder, and yes, we were able, after research and technical research, to prove that this is a drawing by Pieter Bruegel. And here you can see what kind of landscapes. And if you look at this landscape, you will see a structure which you will see in nearly all works of Bruegel, even those works which you at first sight would not define as a landscape. It's a type of landscape that is known in art historical literature as Weltlandschaft, a broad horizontal landscape set up in planes, a front plane, a middle plane, and the background. Front plane, middle ground, and then going into the background. It's a small drawing. You will see it. It's the second drawing in the first gallery. This Weltlandschaft is a hybrid landscape. It's not a drawing made in situ. It's based on drawings. Bruegel must have made hundreds, if not thousands of those, made in nature, and he recomposed them in his workshop or in the places where he stayed during his journey in Italy, recomposing them into refined landscape. Very subtly they'll build up, but always with this structure. And he adds something to this traditional Weltlandschaft, very subtle, for instance, and this is really an innovation, is the fact that Bruegel, not like the artist before him, would stand or let the viewer stand on the highest point and then giving a broad scope in the landscape behind him. No, he would go back a little and stand in front of the highest point of the hill. This is not the highest point of the hill, this is here. It's only then that you go into the open, wide landscape. Then he uses other rhetorical tricks, like here, and you will see it in all the works of Bruegel. If you go to the exhibition, a river connecting the front and the middle plane with the background, a river meandering towards the horizon. It's a structure which you will see in many of his works. This is one of the preparatory drawings of the vices. It's the vice of sin. This is also a landscape. It's the same kind of structure. If you look again, you have the front page, the front plane, the middle plane. You have the river going towards the horizon. It's all there. And of course, this goes further. For instance, this magnificent painting of De la Griet, specifically restored for this exhibition. We're very happy to have found the funding to have this done. De la Griet, I will dwell more on De la Griet slightly later. But there again, you find De la Griet here standing on a high point. Again, not the highest point you start, but slightly up. Then the hill goes down. The middle plane with all the women, we'll speak of them later, here in the middle plane, and a river going up to the horizon. The same kind of structure, the same kind of landscape, and of course, as you all know, this is summed up in one of the most marvelous cycles of landscapes, in my opinion, ever made, the series of the months. And we're very, very happy that to the three landscapes here in Vienna, we could add this one from the Lobkowitz collection. Here you see it, again. You can see it again, the hill, not the highest point. Then you go, I'm sorry, my fingers are a little too thick for all the... Going down into the middle plane, and there you see the river finding its way to the horizon. And it's this kind of landscape that is described, amongst others, by Karel van Mander in the beginnings of the 17th century as the type of landscape any artist should strive to make. And he says the best landscapes are by Pieter Bruegel, and the others in the south are by Titian. And Titian and the landscape woodcuts by Titian and Campagnola were of a tremendous influence for Bruegel. So Bruegel as a landscape artist, this is the fourth point I want to make. And he uses old rhetorical devices which are described in art theory and art books and books on the practice of art, like Van Mander. And one of them I want to dwell upon a little deeper is called in art history, in art historical terms, repoussoir. Repoussoir is something in the front, monumental in the front, giving depth to the back. And once you see the trick, it's a pictorial trick. It's one of the tricks of the trade a painter has to create depth. Because what is art? Art, painting, is nothing else than try to create the illusion of three-dimensionality on a flat wooden panel. And painters have tricks. And then we have the repoussoir. Here you can see, for instance, those trees, magnificent trees, certainly inspired by trees which you will find in drawings and woodcuts after Titian. Here you find those trees, and they give depth to the landscape which opens up here. And if you look at the repoussoir in Bruegel, you take your stroll through the exhibition after the lecture, you will find them everywhere. Very subtle, this great subtle drawing from Berlin, very happy with this drawing. And there you can see that he does it even more subtle. Here you have a double repoussoir. You have one here, and you have this monumental gnarled tree more to the right, giving depth, give a beautiful view through the two trees, and then giving depth to the landscape. And again, you have the same trick, the hill. You have to go up slightly little, there's St. Jerome, and then you find the river going through the landscape. You have a city, and then it goes into the background. And then he innovates on the theme of the repoussoir. We're very sorry that this painting could not come to Vienna, but then Budapest is not too far away. So certainly take a look at this painting. It's one of the highlights. And I would have liked, and we would have liked to show this painting because it's not as well known as many other masterworks by Bruegel, but it's certainly one of the highlights in his oeuvre. It's the preaching of St. John, It's made in 1566. There's a lot to say about this painting, but now the repoussoir. Look at this. One of the first times this is done in art history. A tree, a granal tree, which stands here like this in front. You don't even see the tree, you don't see where it begins, you don't see where it ends. But then leaving this open, and then ending as a repoussoir, this tree here, where, and I will return to this figure seen from the back, you have a view of the landscape, again the landscape opening up with the river going into the background. But he goes even bolder. This was unfortunately too fragile. I'm sorry, I sometimes have to show you pictures which you cannot see, but then a good reason to go to New York. It simply cannot travel. If not for Trump, then at least go for Bruegel. This, of course, is one of the 5 remaining pictures panels from the seasons, the 6th one being lost since the 17th century. And this is really remarkable. You don't realize how innovative this is. Try to find something like this before Bruegel. A repoussoir placed right in the middle of the picture, giving depth to the wide open landscape, the middle plane, the background, again, the river leading up, but also to a more wooded scene where you can see gorgeously painted Flemish-like village in the background. And then the most innovative use of a repoussoir in one of the icons which your museum, presuming that most of you come from Vienna, there you have, of course, one of the great pictures in art history, one which I at least had to learn when I was a first-year student. We got a list of, I think, 1,000 slides which we had to learn by heart in the first 3 months, and there were 3 or 4 by Bruegel, and this was certainly one of them. But what you see here is the repoussoir, very daring, to have a repoussoir done by a rhythmically placed sequence of 4 trees. It's with those 4 trees that you descend into the landscape. And with the views through the trees, you get the depth which is so characteristic of these works. Then we come to something else. Figures seen from the back. Anybody who's involved in the history and analysis of photography or filmmaking knows that framing, cadrage, is extremely important. And if you look in films, the earliest films, the early photographs, starting there, but also if you look at photographs which we make with iPhones or the other means, we often make photographs with somebody seen from the back, not the selfies, of course, but then the other photographs. What is so effective about a figure seen from the back? He invites you. If somebody seen from the back is in the front of a picture, of an image, any image, he invites you to be part of the image. You look with this person into the picture. Again, look at this gorgeously drawn sheet. It's in a private collection. Somewhere in the US, it's a promised gift to the Metropolitan, so it will be, there are only a few works by Bruegel which are still in private collection. This is one of them. But if things work out as they hope, this will be part of the collections of the Metropolitan in a few years. So you have this drawing, and then look here, figures seen from the back. Very clever, I said, Bruegel, not starting here, but placing the figure right on the top. You see him from the back, and we are invited, our eye is led to look into the landscape in the back. And he very cleverly, cunningly, has his hand pointing toward the landscape. Whether we like it or not, we look into this drawing. Beautifully drawn, it's just this big, just a few strokes of the pen. He's one of the greatest draftsmen. I would say Bruegel, he's a great painter, but in the field of drawings, he's one of the top 5 in art history. That's my personal opinion. Here he is, the figure, talking to somebody, companion, showing the companion whatever, the castle, the city, the river, whatever, the open plains, and we are invited to look pictorial strategy on this format. I would dare to say and to state that nowhere in art history, and certainly not in the 16th and 17th century, there is a painter who so effectively and cunningly uses the figure seen from the back as Pieter Bruegel. Go and look through the exhibition and look at the numbers of figures seen from the back. Look with those eyes and then try to understand Bruegel and this pictorial strategy. Another beautiful drawing coming from Berlin, delicately drawn, sometimes seen by scholars as the hallmark of Flemish influence, which is remarkable, as this part, as was proven about 20 years ago by the great scholar, underestimated scholar Karl Arndt, was proven that this part of the drawing was copied after a print by Domenico Campagnola, who made this in Venice in the 30s. So that's the hybrid way of working, combining all kinds of elements into one picture. And then again, here you can see the same drawn again. It's just a centimeter and a half high. The figures seen from the back, introducing the landscape. We walk with those peasants, with the horse rider. He becomes more subtle, more complex. A beautiful drawing of the spring, a preparatory drawing for an engraving. And here, the figures seen slightly from a side, seen from the back, opening up, leading our eye through the composition. And again, here you see a small canal leading through this. Well, is it a village? Is it at the outskirts of a city? Who could say, leading the eye towards the horizon? But I will come back. Figures seen from the back, one of the most complex use of those figures is again in the Budapest painting. There, we look with these figures, we look and search what is happening, what is depicted here. He leads our eye through these images, and then we find what the subject is, the preaching of St. John. This puzzle, this searching for the subject, which is also very typical for the 16th century, I will return to slightly later. He leads our eye, Bruegel leads our eye. He's a sonographer. He thinks in three-dimensional spatial forms. And of course, the other icon here in Vienna, the peasant wedding, and beautiful and so subtle and so clever is how he leads the eye here. This is most probably the groom. There were traditions in the Flemish countryside in the 16th century, going into the 18th, 19th century, that the groom would provide food for the guests at the banquet. You can also see the white text, what could be poems or things or mimicking kind of words which his friends may have written. But my point here is seen from the back. This one is seen from the back. You know all the figures. And then Bruegel leads our eye through this figure, placing towards the bride. The bride and the groom are right opposite it. Bruegel leads he sets the stage and leads our eye to concentrate on the groom. The groom, of course, the bride, as you all know, who is probably pregnant. There's a print related to this composition and the variant from, and also related to the Detroit painting, which said that the bride is full and sweet. In Dutch 16th century, this is very, very clear what it means. And as you can no longer see, you can, as it's overpainted, but you can see it in some copies, there is a couple making love. Of course, this is the reason why she is full and sweet. But it's the pictorial strategy which count here. The people, the figures seen from the back, leading our eye. Also, things which are mentioned in 16th century text for instance, Karel van Mander. Then we come to another aspect which is important in rhetorics in general in the 16th century, which goes back to classical rhetorics. And this is called copia et varietas, which means richness and variety. It was extremely important whether you were composing a poem, whether you're composing music, or you're making a work of art in the 16th century, you were required to have richness and variety. The most popular book for schools, for the Latin grammar schools in the north of Europe, was De Copia, on richness, by Erasmus, reprinted, translated very often. And there, Erasmus really writes also about landscapes. And there he describes landscapes and their richness and their variety actually as if you are walking in a picture in a landscape by Pieter Bruegel. And this is repeated by Karel van Mander. Karel van Mander, who wrote the first art history of the Netherlands, was published in the beginning of the 17th century, but he also wrote a treatise on the art of painting. And there, one of the chapters on the landscape, and there he repeats this copia et varietas, this richness and variety idea. A landscape must have everything which you have in the world. This relates to the essential idea of the macrocosmos and the microcosmos, which also goes back to classical antiquity. The macrocosmos being the universum. In the 16th century, it was paradise, heavens, and the microcosm, that was earth. So for a good painting, a landscape must actually be a depiction of everything which earth, as a recreation, as the earthly paradise, has to offer. So Van Mander writes, in rephrasing actually Erasmus, that a landscape must be broad and open, that a landscape must have steep and tall trees, must have small brooks making their way through the rocks, must have peasants, must have horses, must have meadows, castles, harbors, everything which you will find on earth should be there. Copia et varietas. And if you look with those eyes, those requirements, which were so natural for the circles for which Bruegel worked and in which he worked, then you understand why his paintings and his prints were so popular and why he was essentially seen as a landscape artist. Everywhere where you go in a painting or a composition, this is essentially also a landscape, an open, broad landscape, cityscape. I really like the term which you have in German, a Wimmelbild. We have the Dutch word wemelen, which is the same, but a Wimmelbild is not, it's rather ugly, but this Wimmelbild here, of course, you can understand this richness and variety. Everywhere where you look, you find something to see. And again, of course, if you go to the great cycle of the seasons, there you find the steep rocks, the meadows, the harvesting, the people, the peasants working there, everything which is described by Erasmus and Van Mander seen in one painting, this richness and variety. And Bruegel works on this theme until his very last year. We're very happy to have this painting. It comes from Darmstadt. Even given its small size, it was one of the most difficult paintings to get, but it's here and we're happy with that. The magpie on the gallows, also one of the most enigmatic paintings, but that I will speak briefly upon at the very end of the lecture. But also here, everything which paradise has to offer, everything which earth has to offer, this copia et varietas, richness and variety, is there. Going from the city in the background, the detailed fauna here in front. Here again, you have the river making its way to the background. You have horses, you have boats, you have castles. Everything is there. And then he does this with a technique which hidden not in the Karel van Mander biography, in other places, which Karel van Mander also notes. He notes that Pieter Bruegel was strongly influenced by Bosch. Now, this sentence has been quoted often, but only in relation to the demons, the imagery. But if you read on, you will see that Karel van Mander emphasizes the technique. And he emphasizes the transparency and the looseness and the precision. And that is something which we really have dwelled upon with our curatorial team, really finding, and it took us a long time to get there, but it sounds so very simple, is this unique balance between precision and looseness. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot of painters in the best tradition of the so-called Flemish primitives who are extremely gifted in rendering nature and in rendering their subjects in the most detailed manner. Certainly from the middle of the 16th century, you have a number of artists with a boldness and a brushwork leading up into the 17th century to such painters as Frans Hals and Rembrandt, which have a looseness which is captivating and brilliant. But to have looseness and precision in one image, and you find this in the drawings, and you find this in the paintings. And there's one characteristic thing which is very odd and which we only realized at the very end, is that the precision is not, as you would think, often in the front, but more often in the back. Go and look at the seasons, go and look at the paintings, and you will find the most minute details in the back, in the background of the painting. You will find the most loose and the most transparent way of painting in front. So again here, returning to this drawing, you have an extreme boldness here. As a draftsman, he can be extremely precise, he can be extremely bold. And of course, if you realize that he was trained both in the art of miniatures, but also working, as we think and we suppose, on tapestry cartoons, then you realize what a unique, gifted background he has to make this combination. A combination in the 16th century which you only find in two artists, at this level at least, that is Bosch and Bruegel. And it's illustrating, it's telling that in his time, those two were always compared. And it was said that Bruegel was the first one who surpassed the greatest master from the past, Jeroen Bosch. The looseness and the boldness. Here, for instance, a beautiful drawing from Washington with very bold strokes. I give you an impression, just to go into a detail, to see how bold those strokes are, rapid movements of the pen. But also if you go back to the background, here a much more refined and restricted way of drawings. A combination of the two, which you also find in the paintings. If you look, go one further, if you look here and you look into the foreground, there's this looseness, this transparency. Again, I have to use a technical term. Once a panel has been prepared, then a first tonal layer is added, and we call this the imprimatura. That's often done very rapidly, not in a very how do I say this in English? Not in a very even manner, but in a very loose manner. This gives a tonal color, a tonality to the painting, and this was often done in lighter colors in Bruegel and his time. Other artists, like later, for instance, Rembrandt, would use a dark tonal background and then build up to the light. So this gives the basis. And Bruegel often, and we really looked into this, often uses the imprimatura, not adding much, not putting layer on layer on layer, but boldly leaving this loose imprimatura there in the foreground, and then going into the utmost detail in the background. If you go and look, and those are details, ladies and gentlemen, which you cannot see. There's some details. I had the luxury to look with my colleagues at the paintings from Vienna every 2 months there would be one painting down here, and the ideal light, we would look and stare and gaze, and for 2-3 days we would analyze the paintings. And then it was only with the macro photography that we would see certain details which we simply could not see with the naked eye. So please, ladies and gentlemen, go to our website, Inside Bruegel, where the macro photographs are being combined, and there you delve into the details and then amaze yourself in how he was able to paint on the square centimeter, or perhaps even the square millimeter. Preciseness and looseness and transparency, that are things which were noted in the time of Bruegel. Those are the hallmarks of Bruegel technique. And here, of course, the nest robber. And then look into the background. It's like one of the most loose paintings, also used in the imprimatura of Corot, but better than Corot. I like Corot, so if I say it's better than Corot, then it's really something very good. Very transparent, very loose, and yet very precise. So if you go, for instance, the website Inside Bruegel, and look here, and that's, well, I think Elke's not even 1 centimeter. You will find a door which is half open, and you will see somebody standing behind the door. It's just perhaps 5 to 6 millimeters, and yet it's there and so spot on painted. Then there's something else in the rhetorics. Again, I'm using the hallmarks which were used, the observations which were used in the 16th century. So in rhetorics, rhythm in the 16th century, rhythm and repetition was extremely important. And you see that Bruegel uses rhythm in his works. You can see it here, the trees which are repeated, but then he goes beyond. This is a beautiful drawing, comes from Rotterdam, know it quite well. And there you, for instance, can see how he repeats those trees. And this is a drawing which comes quite close to the suicide of Saul in certain respects, so that's always, scholarship is always work in progress. When I started and first did the catalogue in New York and Rotterdam with all the drawings, I assumed, like the scholars before me, that this was an early drawing done in 52, 53, possibly during his Italian travels. And now comparing it with paintings and other works, I think it should be dated in the 60s, it's much later. And then it should be related to this gorgeous painting. Elke, my compliments for having finished the treatment of this jewel. It's one of the smallest paintings by Pieter Bruegel, not the smallest, but one of the smallest. It's extremely miniature-like. With the Tower of Babel's, the two versions of the Tower of Babel, these are the most miniature-like, the most precisely painted paintings. But why I want to show it here is because of the rhythm. If you just go back to the drawing from Boymans, you will find how he builds up the rhythm through the trees, going up the hill, and he works on this, but adding something else. So this Old Testament scenes, the Philistines who have overwon the Israelite armies. The Israelite armies are fleeing all over the country, all over the landscape. And there you see the Philistines chasing the other army. And there the rhythm of the spears, it's beautifully done and very balanced, very rhythmic, leading up and going into the rhythm of the trees which are strongly related to the Rotterdam dance. Rhythm and repetition are very important. You find it everywhere in his oeuvre. You find it also, this painting was also restored specifically for this exhibition, the first time since the early 17th century. This is the first painting by Bruegel, as far as we know, which came into Spanish possession. It's my thesis that this was because it strongly relates to the Bosch imagery. The Spanish Habsburg court had a very strong taste for the oeuvre of Bosch and its environment, and I think this is one of the reasons why in the early 17th century this, through Italy, came into Spain, and it's now here and restored and treated, and now in its full glory, and for the first time ever leaving Spain as in centuries. But also here, the rhythmic repetition, also the spears, which you will find here, and the people which are all pushed into hell. Rhythm and repetition, of course, done in a very subtle and way. This is too fragile. The Tuchlines, we would love to have, there are now 4 Tuchlines, probably 5 if you add the Brussels one, which is very damaged, but the Tuchlines are very, very fragile. So this is painted on canvas with a tempera-like technique, and specifically in the climate like the Low Countries, which is very humid, they have simply thousands, hundreds of thousands. There were more Tuchline painters in the 16th century in Antwerpen and in Mechelen than there were painters with oil. And yet, nothing remains. A few wretched Tuchline. In Nuremberg, they have about 5, I think, and then some others. And the others which have stayed more or less suggesting what their glory must have been are all in Italy or in Spain, where the climate is more, or let's say, less harmful to this technique. So this is the great Tuchline of the blind leading the blind, and there you find this rhythmic repetition of the figures leading, of course, into the fall, the blind leading the blind, something which has been copied and varied on many occasions. But again, one of the greatest finds in repetition you will find here. I touch upon the trees leading as repoussoir, leading the view, but then this is also repeated, very cleverly done by the hunters, and Bruegel added this one later, and then the repetition, so that the hunters, they're tired, you feel they're cold, you feel that they have not caught much, they're hungry probably, they're weary, and the sadness which they have is then repeated in the figures of the dogs. They also have the shoulders like this. This repetition, this rhythmic balance is very typical. And then we come to something which in Dutch art theory is called ordonnantie. Ordonnance, that's how you place your composition, how you suggest the three-dimensional space, ordonnantie. And ordonnantie, and it's actually how you lead the eye through a composition. Here, and that's a composition which I will end with in a brief moment, we have the figure of every man, and the eye is led through the repetition of every man elk throughout the image. Here, we see that Bruegel was deeply indebted towards theatre. He must have been a member of a rhetorician's chamber. He must have seen the Latin drama, the school dramas, which were so popular in the Northern European cities. He must have seen the popular vulgar drama on the streets. And he uses certain rhetorical tricks to set the stage and to lead the eye. And one of the typical tricks of the rhetoricians' plays in the 16th century to have a commentator present. So the theater would be there, would be a moral play. On the street it could even be an immoral play, but in the schools we suppose it would be it's like more moralistic. And then on the stage, on the side, there would be a commentator who comments, who explains for the public what the moral is, what the lessons are to be learned. We immediately recognize him as a commentator because he has an old-fashioned dress. So we immediately, everybody in the time of Bruegel would have seen this as a somebody who comes from a play, and he comments on what he sees. And this is the preparatory drawing of the engraving of the alchemist. Alchemy, he's not ridiculing alchemy as such. Alchemy was a science. But what he is ridiculing, and that's always the case with Bruegel, is going too far. It's too much. And here you see an alchemist who spends his very last coin in trying to find the philosopher's stone. So you can see here, the woman here has no more money. It's a fool which is literally kindling the fire. And here the last coin is for the last experiment, and that's to no avail. We can see in the background, because there we see the same family going to the hospice, the hospital. But the hospital in the 16th century was not just for medical care, it was also for the poor and the needy. So this is how Bruegel leads the eye with the commentator pointing towards the scene. Here is written in the engraving, you can read alchemist. That's a pun, a word pun on 3 levels, which only works in Dutch. Alchemist, of course, it's the alchemist. Alchemist missed everything, and alchemist is also everything is missed. That's typical for Bruegel. He plays with levels. Bruegel never, ever gives away what is to be said. I will return to this because it's also very typical for the 16th century. Leaving something enigmatic, leaving something riddle-like here. You find this in the rhetorical play, you find this in the dramas, you find this in the literature, you find this in the emblems, and you certainly find it in the theatre. So the commentator who makes comments, who points to what is seen, but you see it everywhere. This is a drawing which I still could trace in 2001. I had it in the selection for New York and Rotterdam, but it changed my ownership, and we had a chase for about 4 years, but we could not find the owner, alas. Beautiful drawing, skating and ice fun before the city of Antwerp. You have to realize that this is the period which is the beginning of what we call the small ice age. It was the beginning of a period of about 150 years, starting in the middle of the 16th century, where the average temperature dropped 1 to 2 degrees, leading to much longer winters, leading to the rivers being frozen over, and of course also leading to problems with food supplies in the city. So here we find this winter scene, and there, for instance, you have the commentator, but in a different way, also again leading the eye. Here again the figure seen from the back. Here you see an old woman sitting there. You can, if you look at the drawing, you can actually hear her scolding. You can imagine the high tone of her voice, screaming. And what is she looking at? She's looking at people who have fallen here, or perhaps even pointing towards one poor skater who has sunk through the ice where the ice was too thin. In a later edition of the print, this is the preparatory drawing, there are text added, and these texts, they dwell on the slipperiness of human life. And if you stand on the ice and you skate, you seem to be there very firm, but every moment you can fall, and that's like life itself is. You might be on top of things, but anything can happen and all can change. Commentators, you find them again going back to the Budapest painting. Here, commentators looking on, and here Bruegel does something which is quite humorous, at least which people in the 16th century found humorous. Here you have the group which are clearly gypsies. They were called Tzigane in the period. They relate to woodcuts and engravings where people from with the same costumes are depicted in the 16th century. At that point, they considered the Tzigane to come from Egypt, somewhere in the Middle Ages. And of course, you had fortune tellers as well. And here, it's also kind of psychological trick. Here you see somebody from the back focusing attention on what is happening here. And there you see a fortune teller. You see one of the Tzigane, one of the gypsies, touching upon the hand of somebody who in a costume is typically a bourgeois from a city, looking at us. And then there's a kind of a psychological effect which Bruegel has. This gypsy, he looks at the gypsy, wondering what is being foretold, probably richness, fortune, beautiful wife, whatever, healthy children, whatever might happen. You can see he's staring a little bluntly. Do I believe this or not? The gypsy himself looks at us, at the beholder, with a gaze. I'm playing a trick. But then, what is the deeper layer? Because if we doubt whether the gypsy is telling the truth or not, or whether he's hearing something which is real. Then we go to the real scene, the preaching of St. John. How do we judge this? The people listening to the preaching of St. John from the Gospels, is it true or is it not? And then if you think of the context, this is 1566. In the moment where there was a decisive moment in religious history in the Low Countries, where there would be Calvinist preachers dwelling through the countryside, not being allowed to preach in the cities themselves, but in the best Dutch tradition, which we call gedogen. You say something is forbidden, but then you create an opportunity to do it elsewhere, but then that's gedogen. They were being held at the outskirts of the city. Everybody knew there were society events. We have descriptions of what they call hagepreken, preachings in the field, but they were not actually in the fields, they were just outside the city skirts. We have descriptions of those hagepreken that thousands of people would attend. So they were, whether you were Calvinist or not, didn't even matter. Something was happening. So then you wonder, is this refers, alludes to the Calvinist preachers? Is he telling the truth? Is he not telling the truth? Is he like a gypsy? Is he fooling us? Is St. John fooling us? Are the preachers fooling us? That's the kind of allusions which Bruegel likes to make, not giving one answers, but placing you in a position that you have to think, what is happening here and what is my position here on earth? Setting the stage, we had this one. I spoke a little too much on this painting, and you know all well. I would like to think that Bruegel would be somebody like this. We know, even those are anecdotes written after his death, but we know that Bruegel must have made many trips to the countryside. But the anecdotes are based on anecdotes from his direct friends and relatives. So there's this anecdote that Bruegel would like to dress up with his merchant friends, rich friends. He would like to dress up like a peasant and then go into the countryside just outside the city and to observe them. And of course, I'm not saying, that would be ridiculous, that this is a self-portrait by Bruegel, but standing here, commenting, pointing towards the image, observing, that's something which I think is somebody who Bruegel could be. Observing life, observing human nature, observing the condition humaine, man with its flaws. He did the series of virtues and vices, man with his flaws, with his strengths, his liveliness. That, I think, could be Bruegel. And he was, let me come to another aspect, going to the end of the lecture, is his humor, his wit. That was written about extensively. He was called Pieter den Drol, which is Peter the Joker. And Van Mander writes that nobody could look at any image by Pieter Bruegel, even if he was sour as anything, with at least twitching his lips a little or raising his eyebrows. So that the humor was well recognized. Whether you like the humor or not is something else. So you find the humor, you could find the humor even in the sins. Anybody who has read Dante can, I think, agree that reading about sins is much more fun to do than try to wrestle through paradise. So the sins are funny to look at, witty animals in the best Boschian traditions, wit, humor, you will find everywhere. But you also find it in drawings such as this, as I showed you earlier. It's a drawing from the National Gallery in Washington. Here, for instance, and again, a small drawing, marvelously drawn, rapidly drawn, but then here you will find a romantic couple making a pastoral stroll through the landscape. But the same couple you will find here. And there it's a little less pastoral, it's getting more physical. There you see the girl, and there you see the hand of the boy or the man going under the skirts. Let's hope it was with her permission, going under the skirts. And there you see an old peasant, and if you look at the peasant, you actually feel that his eye bulbs are growing. gazing at what is happening here in front of him. That's the kind of humor, irony, wit, visual fun, visual puns. You find it on more abstract level. This is one of the virtues. You could give lectures on the virtues alone. It's very complicated images. But here Bruegel plays in an ironical, in a very witty way, he plays with water. So this is hope, spes. So basically what is important in life is that you must hope for whatever happens in life, that you must hope for the best fate in the life after life. Because in the 15th and 16th century, life itself was just passing a moment on the way to the real purpose in life, and that was life after life, after the second coming of Christ and the final judgment. So spes, hope, is important. And here, besides many other things, he plays with water. It's very clear that there is too much water, and wild water here on the left. Ships are sinking, monsters which relate to the Old Testament monster Leviathan are here. Here is somebody, his hairs are really standing up, nice kind of detail, so afraid his hairs are really standing stiff. The haren ten berge reizen, I don't know if you have the expression, but if your hairs stand upright, if you have the expression in German, but that relates to this expression, far too much water. But then if you go more to the right, not enough water. They may have had water and bread, but apparently the water was not much. As here, the poor sods have hung something outside their cell, hoping to catch a little water from the rain. Too much water, too little water. Too much water, and here, fire. In the cities in Northern Europe, very densely built, with a lot of wooden houses, wooden structure, fire was extremely important, trying to control fire. A fire could effectively destroy half a city in 2 or 3 days. So here, not enough water, too much water, not enough water. And here, there, you see a peasant, a farmer, who's trying to build little dams, little dikes to prevent his fields from being flooded. Too much water, too little water, playing on a very witty but kind of intellectual way. But it could also be going into more vernacular traditions. It's Lui lekker land, the land of plenty, the land of cocaine, which is in Munich. Also this panel was unfortunately too fragile to travel, but Vol le Voyage. There are many things in Munich which are nice, but this certainly is one of them. So it's the land of cocaine, the land of plenty, the land, and look at all kinds of witty details. One of my personal favorites, I have it as a magnet on my refrigerator, is this egg with legs, which has already a spoon in it, so you can eat it. Here you have a pig which is alive, and yet you can cut slices of bacon from it. Witty details here. How do you get? Because this refers or goes back to a well-known play, a vernacular play, which was popular in the 40s in Antwerpen, with the same theme. You had to get there, and you had to eat your way to get to this land of plenty. You had to eat your way through a mountain of porridge. And rijstenbrei, a porridge made of rice. And there you see typical Bruegel humor. Here you see somebody has eaten his way and is already falling, and the thing with which he ate his way is falling here, lies beneath, and here he falls, having eaten his way through this mountain of porridge and then tumbling into the land of plenty. Humorous, yes, to a certain extent. This was hanging by the most rich and wealthy. This was made in a period where hunger, extreme hunger, was there, where large parts of the city of Antwerp could not be fed, where all the people coming en masse to the cities from the countryside, where there were strifes, where there were troops, was not enough food. how to feed them, issues and who was going to feed them. Was this something private to be led to the church? Was this something to be done by the authorities? Could city actually cope with such numbers, thousands, tens of thousands of people flocking into the cities? So this was there, hanging in the wealthy burghers. Yes, fun, but on the other hand, this land of plenty was a land which few saw in those years. Humor in another way, reversal, for instance. You can tell a lot about the dulle Griet, but here he plays with a reversal of the order of society. It was very typical for the cities in the northwest of Europe, in the Low Countries, that there were days, carnival, and not only the carnival in March, you had several carnivals which would be the beginning of a period where you would eat less. But anyway, you had the carnival, and then there would be, the order would be reversed. There would be a mock mayor, there would be mock bishops. And you also had a tradition in where the order between, the hierarchical order between man and woman would be reversed. You had traditions like the row about trousers, the strijd om de broek, which was, you see men and women fighting about the trousers, and of course, the woman who had the trousers on was the one who had to say. By the way, the women in the Low Countries were considered to be very, very liberal and independent. So we know this by Ludovico Guarciardini, who came from Florence, who wrote an extensive diary about his travels in the Netherlands, and he comments on more than one occasion on the fact that women in Antwerp were so free and independent. But yet the order, of course, was a classical order. And here we see that for one moment the order is reversed. It is Griet who is in charge. It's Griet in charge of a band of angry women which are so fierce that even the devils and demons in hell are being scared. There was an illustrious Griet who we know, who had to flee from Antwerp, apparently was a tall woman in this period. But any person in this period who would hear the name Griet, at least in the circles of Bruegel, would also think not only about this illustrious woman which had to flee Antwerp, but would think of the most powerful woman in the southern countries, Margaretha of Parma, the governor in charge of the Low Countries on behalf of the Habsburg Empire. Margaret and Griet were the same names. Playing with those layers, an allusion to illustrious woman fleeing the city, allusions to the most powerful women. Also playing it here, Griet is carrying a sword. There was very strict regulations about carrying swords. It was nobility, you were men, very clearly defined. You could not simply go around with a sword. You could be punished very heavily if you do not fall under the categories. But she is certainly wielding it with great force. You would not like to meet her in this manner. But then, tongue-in-cheek, what he does here, he adds a large frying pan. If in the end, if it need be, the frying pan would be a more lethal weapon or a more effective weapon than the sword. Visual humor you will find, for instance, in the New York. Look, for instance, here. Bruegel, here, this man is cutting the grain, harvesting, and he looks very eagerly at something which is waiting here. It's a cask with probably beer. Water was too dangerous to drink. It was mostly beer, which they drank in this period. A hat above it so that there could be no fleas going in the beer. And this man really looking at it, staring at, hoping that his point of resting here would come. Other irony and visual puns you will find here. Also, you have this rhythmic placing against rhythm, repetition of the haystacks here. And then he adds these women who are glazing the grain which is left in the field in a very funny way. is that this woman bending around has exactly the same form as the haystacks which are here. Those are the visual puns with which you can recognize Bruegel, the visual puns which were so popular in his time. Again, look at this great drawing of spring, preparatory drawing for an engraving. Here, what Bruegel does is also psychology, visual psychology. Here he places a spade. It's through this spade that we suddenly realize there must be somebody gone. Would he have to pee? Would he have a rest? What was he doing? It's a visual trick. It's kind of a visual riddle. Everybody has to think about the spade when he looks. Who is that? Who's the person who is working there? And have the nice contrast between these people working hard and the spade which is resting here in the garden. This is the kind of visual pun, the visual humor which they liked. And then you come to one of the last categories is the enigmatic aspect. Bruegel as a painter who does not give away the subject. This relates to the way which the 16th century in the north of Europe people looked at art, looked at literature, looked at drama, trying a riddle-like quality. This is the age of the emblems. Emblems are a combination of an image, a motto, and a text, where you have to try to find the balance and the meaning of the three and how they relate to each other. Very typical for the Northern Renaissance and the municipal culture. So again, you will find those riddles here. At first, this is a beautiful winter landscape. Bruegel is one of the first who starts, as I said, it's the beginning of the Ice Age, and the winters were colder, so Bruegel stands at the beginning of winter landscapes. But you really have to search before you find what the subject is. And then you slowly discover it's the copia and viva, it's a rich variety. Then you see this is Joseph with Mary and a child, and it's the census in Bethlehem which is depicted. The same kind of strategy in hiding the subject, of course, is in the carrying of the cross, where this immediately leaps to the eye, deliberately done in a style of costumes which goes back, and a way of placing the figures which goes back to the late 15th century. And then you have to search, and then through the rhythmic placing of the guards in their red tunics, that you then find here Christ carrying the cross, making his way to Golgotha, which you see there, not directly giving it, but having a kind of visual puzzle, something to talk about. And then we come, skip this and go there. Oh, no, I think I'm going too fast. You come to the other paintings where you find the same kind of riddles, as I said here, finding St. John the Baptist. Here, it's getting more enigmatic. What actually is the meaning? You have the gallows, you have a magpie sitting on it, you have people dancing here in front, people watching and pointing towards the gallows. There's a kind of a feast going on in the city, as yet in its entirety, not yet explained. Enigmatic. Certainly in the last year, in 1568, the paintings by Bruegel, it's the last room, the large gallery, there we actually leave our public with a puzzle. I think a good exhibition leaves you with as much questions as answers, so I hope we succeed. Enigmatic, the most enigmatic work, and we're very happy to have this in relation to the nest robber, is the beekeepers, where notwithstanding that there is a text, he who knows the nest knows it, he who has the nest has it. Yes, but what does it help to explain what these people, are they beekeepers, are they thieves? It has been seen in a political context, it has been sexually explained, it has been, books have been written about this, but as yet There is no convincing interpretation of this riddle, this enigma which Bruegel has left. And that leads us to what I like to end with. And I'm again going back to Erasmus. The Erasmus, you cannot understand the Netherlands and the Dutch culture or the culture in the Low Countries if you do not know what Erasmus is about. It's essential, the Erasmian strain in the 16th century in the Low Countries. And Erasmus has also written about convivium. He's written a lot about convivium. What is a convivium? It has two meanings, and I find both of them quite appealing, but that tells something about me. The convivium, is a meal with friends. Food, wine, beer, sitting together, eating, drinking. Nice, I would say. The other meaning of convivium in 16th century Latin is a gathering of people who discuss essential aspects of society, of life. And Erasmus gives all kinds of examples. And he also gives examples where people discuss art, where they discuss landscapes, where they discuss books, prints going around. Art as a conversation piece. Art as a point of discussion. If you go to Berlin, for instance, and you look at the Sprichwörter, so often do you see people standing there, 3, 4 of them, family, friends, grandparents with their grandchildren, looking at the Sprichwörter, at the proverbs, and trying to find out which proverb is depicted. Do you know this? Do you know that? Conversation pieces. People, of course, it is an upper part of society, would sit together and discuss works like these. We know, for instance, that this painting, the entire cycle of the seasons, they hang in the dining room of Nicolaas Jongeling, this venture capitalist who gambled and lost his entire fortune, but at one moment had a very important art collection, including probably 15 works by Pieter Bruegel. And we know that the seasons were hanging in his dining room, not his townhouse, but his country house, which was about 3 kilometers outside of the city of Antwerp. So you can imagine friends, and Bruegel belonged to this circle, sitting there at a dinner, seeing landscapes through the windows, and seeing the cycle of the seasons around them. And you can imagine, can you not? And this is why people gaze so long at a Bruegel, whether the seasons or the Wimmelbilder or the small drawings, and you can imagine people sitting there discussing, talking to each other. Conversation pieces. That, in Bruegel scholarship, is quite recent, but a very, in my opinion, very convincing interpretation of situating the art and understanding the art of Bruegel. And is this not relevant for us today? Going to a museum, seeing art and discussing art together, although it may now sometimes be too crowded to have a lot of discussions, but then you can come back after the exhibition and go to the Bruegel room. But not only works hanging there, and I come to the last 2 slides. This is the smallest painting by Pieter Bruegel. Perhaps just as large, no, perhaps the beggars are smaller. But anyway, one of the 2 smallest paintings, also one of my favorites, hangs in Berlin in the Gemäldegallery. 2 monkeys. Antwerp, as I said, thriving city, the most important harbor, most international harbor. Ships were coming all over the world to Antwerp. Bruegel, we know, must have made hundreds of drawings of the ships themselves, and he must have made drawings of those exotic animals. Occasionally an elephant would come, occasionally a rhinoceros would come. This happened twice in the 16th century, but more regular from the 3rd decade onwards were shipments of monkeys and of exotic birds, which by the nobility and the most rich in the cities were used to show off their wealth. So here we have those two as examples, and you have the harbor of Antwerp in the back. You can recognize this in comparing it with prints from the same period. Again, books and chapters and articles have been written, but I think what a Dutch scholar in his dissertation a few years ago, Matthijs Ilsink, wrote is a very interesting line of thought and brings us back to this conversation piece. There was a popular statement, again going back to classical antiquity, classical rhetorics, saying ars simia naturae. Art is the ape of nature, implying, because this was not only about the visual arts, that art in general had a mimetic nature. Whether you were composing music, whether you were writing a drama, writing a poem, or painting, you were mimicking nature. And you have in Dutch the expression naapen. Naapen is why do we appreciate monkeys, at least many of us? If you go to the zoo, whether it's in Schönbrunn or in Antwerp, why do we like monkeys? Because there's a human-like, we like to think. And because we think, or they do mimic. They mimic each other, and they mimic humans. And it's this mimicking aspect of monkeys which was used in this expression ars simia naturae, which was repeated in art theory in the 16th and 17th century, specifically for the visual arts. Because, as I said, what is painting? Painting is trying to create an illusion of reality, which is only a two-dimensional illusion, a three-dimensional reality. And you can imagine, in a circle of friends, artists, rhetoricians, humanists, a work like this going around to reflect on the mimicking art, the imitative aspect of art itself. And that would be very typical, because the generation of Pieter Bruegel is the first generation of artists in the North who reflect on art as art. Think about art, reflect on specific aspects of art and what defines art. You find this in art treatises in the 16th century. And then, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to end with an image which is possibly my Bruegel, but which is also very typical for the third quarter of the 16th century. Elk. Elk, in German jedermann, in English everybody, everyone, was hanging in the air, so to say, was a topic which you will find not only in the Netherlands, but also in English literature and elsewhere. Elk, in the third quarter of the 16th century, was man looking for who he is, what defines him, what his nature is, and how he relates to God and the world. We know, for instance, that in 1561, in a rhetoricians competition, you had what we call in Dutch a landjuweel. That was a 3-yearly competition of rhetorician chambers. It still exists, where rhetorician chambers from all over the Low Countries could stage plays around certain themes. There would be competition, and after a few months there would be a winner, etc. And one of the themes of the 1561 landjuweel was elk. This was made slightly earlier, 1559. So what do you see? And in the exhibition you will see the drawing, but I've chosen the engraving because here you can read the text. You see a figure, an old man with a long beard, with a lamp, burning lamp. It's very convenient. It's written elk, so we know who he is. Here's elk, here's elk. You'll find 7 elks, every man here. Here you find nemo non, nobody not. That's the Latin variant of elk. And everybody in the surroundings of Bruegel, coming from his background, would have understood the allusion. This is not only elk. This is an allusion to a famous philosopher from classical antiquity, Diogenes, one of the cynics, yielding all worldly possessions, living in Athens. And we know there are 2 very famous stories about which, at least in my Latin school, I learned them, and perhaps it's the same in the gymnasium here. There are 2 very famous stories. The one is Diogenes walking through Athens, that would be in the 2nd century before Christ, in broad daylight with a lamp burning. He would be walking around, and of course his fellow citizens would ask, "But Diogenes, what are you doing here, walking with a lamp in broad daylight?" And he would answer, "I'm looking for a real human. A truthful, real human." And of course, he didn't find him. That's the symbolism. Walking there with a lamp in broad daylight implies that you will not find such a person, such a soul. And here you can see elk looking for truth or whatever. We'll dwell upon this later. He has glasses. Doesn't find anything. He looks in the worldly possessions. He's pulling with another elk to see if he can gain some object here. We'll find him here. He works here. He looks everywhere. Looks at the military camp here at the back. Is the truth, is power, is what the essences of life to be found in military force. And at the very back, you'll find a small elk here in front of the church. But then the question would be, in this period, which church? The Zwinglians, the Calvinists, the Lutheranians, all kinds of groups in between, or the Roman Catholic Church. Very funny. There's another allusion which everybody would have understood. Diogenes lived in Athens, and he lived at the outskirts of the city of Athens. And he lived in a barrel, having forsaken all worldly possessions. And of course the emperor comes, as they do in those kind of stories, and asks. He comes, of course, pompous, etc., and he stands in front of the barrel and says, "Oh, Diogenes, is there anything, you famous, etc., 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 is there anything which I can do for you?" Implying that he could give money, he could give land, possessions. And the only thing which Diogenes said is, "Please go a few feet aside because you're standing in my daylight." So the barrel and this person, everybody would have understood, not as a representation of Diogenes, but an illusion. And what then is this about? The clue is here. There you see a jester. You know, as I do, that the jester is the only one at a court who can tell the truth, because it's done in a joke. He can tell the naked truth. And the jester has a mirror, looking into it, looking for self-insight, getting to know him. Of course, the implication is that a jester will never have the self-knowledge. On the other hand, if the jester tells the truth, he may well be the only one who has self-insight. Who knows? And then you read this. Niemand kent hemzelf. Nobody knows himself. And this is what it is about. This is what you will find in all the works by Pieter Bruegel, if you look into the deeper layers. Pieter Bruegel observes mankind, the virtues, the vices, their humor, their worldliness. It's a search, ladies and gentlemen, for the balance in life. But it is also about choices. These were the most disruptive period, was the most disruptive period in the history of the Low Countries. It was the battle between the Reformist movement and the Catholics. The cities were rebelling against the centralization of the Habsburg monarchy. The lower nobility, very conservative, battling against the higher nobility and the Habsburg power about their rights and their incomes and taxation. There were strifes everywhere, and choices in this period, in the 50s and 60s, were decisive. Where did you stand? Who were you and where did you stand? And where do you stand looking at life after death? What were your choices? This is about choice. This was a print which was printed probably in 4,000 or 5,000 impressions, which was also copied, spread throughout Europe. It was a search for who we are and what choices we make in a society which is at large. And if anything is relevant to our society, what if this is not, what then? Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.